Okay, picture this. It's 2023, a small community-based organization in Nairobi. Let's call them the Mathare Youth Empowerment Initiative. Receives a grant of about 2 million shillings from an international donor to run a vocational training program. 6 months later, they submit their final report. Everything is accounted for. Receipts, invoices, attendance registers, photographs of the training sessions, even fuel logs for the van that transported participants. But there's a problem. One of the receipts is missing. Just one. For 8,000 shillings or 8,000 bob. Office supplies, a stapler, some pens, folders. The finance officer forgot to attach the receipt. The donor freezes the entire organization's account, demands a full audit, questions every other line item. Eventually, they claw back 500,000 bob, blacklists the organization from future funding. The youth program shuts down completely. Now, same year, 2023, the Kenyan government receives the sixth tranche of the $3.6 billion extended fund facility and extended credit facility arrangement from the International Monetary Fund. According to the Auditor-General's report for the year 2022-2023 fiscal year, the government has 178 billion shillings in irregular expenditures, 92 stall road projects worth 54 billion shillings, 23 county hospitals built but not equipped, totaling to 8.7 billion shillings, ghost teachers still on the payroll in 14 counties under fertilizer subsidy program, where 40% of the funds cannot be accounted for. The IMF releases the money anyway. No freeze. No clawback, no blacklist. In fact, the IMF praises Kenya's commitment to fiscal consolidation. Welcome to the Kenyan Week that was. I'm your host, Diwa, and today we are asking a very simple question. Why must NGOs prove every shilling while the Kenyan state or Kenyan government borrows billions despite failing every audit? Or to put it bluntly, why doesn't the IMF care if Kenya is corrupt? Spoiler alert. Because it's strictly business. Let's start with what we know. If you ever worked with an international donor, the USAID, the Gates Foundation, Comic Relief, any of them, you know the drill. The application process alone is like sitting for an PhD. You need theory of change, logical framework, a monitoring and evaluation plan, baseline data, safeguarding policies, financial controls, gender strategies, environmental assessments. And if you get the money, boy, oh boy, the reporting requirements could choke a horse. Quarterly financial reports, narrative reports, impact reports, beneficiary feedback, independent audits, spot checks, field visits. They will count your freaking staplers. And here's the thing. This is actually good practice. So don't get me wrong. I ain't even here to chastise that process because I believe when you're spending public or donated money, you should be accountable. You should prove that each of the monies did what you said it was exactly going to do. So no arguments there. But then you look at how governments borrow and the rules just evaporate. Let me give you the Kenyan numbers straight from the Auditor General. Fiscal year is 2022 to 2023. Irregular expenditure, 178.4 billion shillings. That's money spent without proper documentation, without following procurement law, or just missing. Stall projects, the report identifies 92 road projects allocated 54 billion shillings that have been abandoned mid-construction, some even over 5 years. Ghost institutions, 23 hospitals built under the Managed Equipment Services Scheme, fully constructed, sadly never equipped, never opened. Cost, 8.7 billion shillings. Uwezo Fund, Youth Fund, Women's Fund. These empowerment programs, totaling to over 12 billion shillings in disbursement, have a recovery rate below 30%, meaning 70% of the money is just gone. And the Auditor General notes that the loan records are incomplete and unverifiable. Now, The Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, EACC, estimates that about a third of Kenya's annual budget is lost to corruption. That's not me being dramatic. That's the EACC's estimate. 1/3. If Mathare Youth Empowerment Initiative lost a third of their 2 million shillings grant, you know what would happen? They wouldn't just be blacklisted. They'd be criminal investigations. People would have to go to jail. But when it's the government of Kenya, the IMF sends a mission. They have tea at the treasury. They write a very quote unquote stern report noting governance challenges. And then they release the next tranche. So what's going on here? Is the IMF just stupid? Do they not know about the corruption? Oh, let me make it clear. They do. They really do know about it. Every IMF Article 4 consultation report mentions it. Every staff report mentions it. Every program review mentions it. Governance challenges, weak institutions, revenue leakage, procurement irregularities. They have a whole vocabulary for it. So, if they know, and we know they do, why do they keep giving us money? Why do they keep lending? That's what we are here to figure out. To understand why the IMF keeps lending to Kenya despite the corruption, we need to understand what the IMF actually is. And here's the first thing you need to know. The IMF is not a development agency. I know. Come on. Cool down. It sounds like one. It talks about supporting growth and reducing poverty and all that BS. But functionally, structurally, the IMF is a crisis lender. Think about it this way. The World Bank is theoretically supposed to build things. You know, the roads, schools, power plants. That's the pitch anyway. Even if reality is complicated. The IMF, on the other hand, the IMF is the financial fire brigade. When your economy is on fire, currency is collapsing, reserves are depleted, and you can't pay your bills, you don't call the World Bank, you call the IMF. And the IMF will lend you money, but only if you agree to their conditions. Now, here's the key question. What are those conditions designed to do? Build better hospitals, perhaps? Never. End corruption? Hell no. Create jobs? Absolutely freaking no. The conditions are designed to ensure you as a state can pay the IMF back. That's it. That's the whole game. We could actually wrap up this podcast right here. But let me quote someone who understands this better than most. One Mr. Ken Gishinga, an economist who's been tracking Kenya's IMF programs for years. He put it perfectly. For the IMF, it's strictly business. They are not charity. They are not the UN. They care about one thing and one thing only. Will Kenya pay them back? Strictly business. So, what does the IMF monitor? Let's look at the actual program documents. When Kenya signed the 2021 Extended Fund Facility and the Extended Credit Facility, that $3.6 billion program I mentioned earlier, the IMF set out something called quantitative performance criteria. These are the hard targets. Yeah, let me laugh. These are the hard targets Kenya has to hit to keep getting money. Ready? Here they are. Fiscal deficit targets. Kenya's budget deficit can't exceed a certain percentage of their GDP. How much foreign currency the central bank actually holds. Public debt ceiling. Total government debt cannot exceed a certain level. No new external arrears. Kenya can't default on existing loans. Notice what's not on the list. Yeah, just take a listen to what I've said. Just, be the judge on this. Notice what is not on the list. Number 1, number of hospitals built. 2, number of roads completed. 3, teachers to student ratios. 4, maternity mortality rates. 5, and it's a big one, corruption prosecution rates. Literally, any measure of whether Kenyans are better off after getting the said amount of money. The IMF also sets structural benchmarks. These are the policy changes Kenya has to make. And what are they? Increase tax revenue, cut public spending, reform state-owned enterprises, which usually means privatization or layoffs, remove subsidies, tighten monetary policy. Again, notice the pattern. Every single one of these is about fiscal compression. Squeeze more revenue, cut more spending, free up more money for debt repayment and debt service. Now, does the IMF mention corruption in its reports? Of course. They would be foolish if they didn't. All goddamn time. The 2023 Article 4 consultation report for Kenya has a whole section on governance. It notes weakness in public financial management and procurement irregularities and recommends strengthening oversight institutions. Very serious. Very, very concerned. But here's the thing. Those are, what do we call them? They're recommendations and not conditions. You know what is a condition? Raising VAT. That's a condition. Cutting the wage bill. Condition. Removing fuel subsidies. Condition. Prosecuting the corrupt officials. That's where we draw the line. It's a freaking recommendation. See the difference? The IMF will not recommend you to fight corruption, but it will require you to raise taxes on ordinary Kenyans because, and I cannot stress this enough, the IMF doesn't care if the money is stolen or not, as long as Kenya can still repay the loan. And how does the IMF know Kenya can still repay the loan? How? They look at the macro physical indicators. Is Kenya still collecting tax revenue? Yeah. Good. Yes. Good. Does Kenya still have some foreign exchange reserves? Yes. Good. Is Kenya's debt to GDP ratio apocalyptic or just very bad? Just very bad. Good enough. That's the assessment. Not are Kenyans getting healthcare. But can Kenya still squeeze its citizens for more tax revenue? In 2024, when Kenyans took to the streets to protest the finance bill, a bill literally designed to raise taxes to meet IMF targets, did the IMF pause the program? Hell no. Did they hang? Maybe we should reconsider these austerity demands given the massive public unrest? Never. They praised Kenya's commitment to fiscal consolidation because the protests didn't threaten Kenya's ability to pay back the IMF. The protests threatened Kenyans, but not the IMF's money. And that's strictly, again I repeat, strictly business. Okay, so we've established that the IMF doesn't monitor corruption because corruption isn't their problem. The problem is repayment. But here's where it gets even darker. Because the policies the IMF does require, the austerity, the tax increases, the spending cuts, these policies don't just ignore corruption. They make it worse. Let me explain. When the IMF lends Kenya, it comes with conditions. We've covered this, and the most common conditions are what economists call fiscal consolidation, which is a fancy way of saying spend less, tax more. Now, in theory, this makes sense, right? If you're borrowing too much, you should tighten your belts. Except Kenya isn't a household. It's an economy, and economies don't work like household budgets. When you cut government spending during a period of weak growth, you don't just save money, you shrink the economy. Fewer government contracts means businesses lose income. Businesses losing incomes, they lay off workers. Workers lose jobs, they spend less, and they spend less. And because they spend less, businesses lose more income. It's a downward spiral. And when the economy shrinks, guess what happens to tax revenue? Ding, ding, ding. It falls. So now you've cut spending. The economy is weaker and you're collecting less tax revenue than before, which means you are further from the physical targets. So what does the IMF say? Well, clearly you need to cut spending more and raise taxes. Raise the taxes more. This is what happened with the Finance Bill 2024. Kenya needed to meet its fiscal deficit targets. Revenue was falling short. So the Treasury drafted a bill to raise taxes. To raise taxes. Lots of taxes. VAT on bread, increased fuel levies, new motor vehicle taxes, eco levies on basically everything. The bill was a greatest hit of regressive taxation, meaning it hit the poor the hardest. And Kenyans said astronomically no. Gen Zs took to the streets. Millions of people. The protests shut down Nairobi. The president had to withdraw the bill and it was a huge, unprecedented moment of people power. But here's the problem. The physical gap didn't go away. Kenya still needed to meet the IMF targets. So what happened? The Finance 2025 or Finance Bill of 2025, different taxes, same goal. Squeeze more revenue out of ordinary Kenyans to service debt. And here's the trap. The IMF program requires Kenya to reduce its fiscal deficit. But the ways to do it are raise revenues, which means taxing Kenyans more, which sparks unrest, or cut spending, which means fewer services, which also sparks unrest. And you know what Kenya doesn't cut? Debt service. In the 2024-2025 budget, Kenya allocated education 544 billion shillings, health 111 billion shillings, infrastructure 202 billion shillings. Now, what do you think they allocated for debt service? 1.5 trillion shillings. Debt service is larger than education, health, and infrastructure combined. So when the IMF says cut spending, what does that mean in practice? It means cut teachers' salaries, cut medicine budgets, cut road maintenance. It does not mean cut debt service. Because debt service is the whole point of the goddamn program. And here's where the corruption piece comes back in. When you cut public sector budgets, you'd think, okay, less money, less corruption, right? Wrong. Because the corrupt systems don't disappear. They just get more vicious. When there's less money in the pot, the fight over that money gets more intense. The informal taxes, the kickbacks, the ghost workers, they all stay in place. But now that money, or the money that should go to medicine or to the teachers' salaries, gets looted fast. And then the IMF tells Kenya to cut these budgets even more. It's elegant, really. Austerity doesn't reduce corruption. It protects it. Because when budgets shrink, the powerful make sure they still eat. It's everyone else who gets to starve. And the IMF doesn't give two hoots about it. Because as long as Kenya keeps raising taxes and cutting services, the debt service is guaranteed. And like I said, it's strictly business. All right, we need to talk about something uncomfortable. When Kenya borrows, when they borrow from the IMF or from anyone really, where does that money actually go? You'd think schools, hospitals, roads, development, yada, yada, yada. And sometimes a tiny fraction does go there. But most of it goes into paying back other lenders. This is called debt refinancing, or as I like to call it, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And here's how it works. Kenya owes money to a bunch of different creditors, international bondholders, China, for the SGR and other infrastructure, World Bank, African Development Bank, commercial banks. Some of this debt is coming due. Kenya needs to pay it back or default, but Kenya doesn't have the money. So Kenya borrows from the IMF and then uses that IMF money to pay the bond holders. It's not bond development finance, it's liquidity management. The IMF isn't funding hospitals, it's making sure Citibank gets paid. And here's the kicker: the IMF knows this properly. It's part of their model. In fact, one of the IMF explicit roles is to provide what they call catalytic financing, meaning their loans reassure other lenders that Kenya is stable so those lenders don't panic and pull out. Think about that. The IMF is essentially the guy at the poker table who says, don't worry, he's good for it. So everyone else stays in the game. Now, before we go further, I want to zoom out for a second, because you might be thinking, is this just Kenya? Are we uniquely bad at this? And the answer to this is hell no. This is a pattern. And let me show you who else is knee deep in IMF debt right now. As of 2025, these are the top 10 countries with the highest IMF credit. Number 1, Argentina, $41 to $56 billion in IMF debt. Number 2, Ukraine, $14 billion. Number 3, Egypt, $9 to $11 billion. Number 4, Pakistan, $9 billion. Number 5, Ecuador, $8.8 billion. Number 6, Cote d'Ivoire, $4.2 billion. Number 7, Kenya. We finally made to the greatest debt list with $4.09 billion. Number 8, Bangladesh, just under $4 billion. Number 9, Ghana, $3.6 billion. Number 10, Angola, $3.6 billion. Notice anything about that list? Not a lot of Scandinavian countries are there. No Switzerland, no Singapore, no Germany. These are what the development world politely calls emerging markets. And what the rest of us call countries that got screwed by colonialism and now can't escape the debt trap. And here's what's important. Every single one of these countries has the same problem that Kenya has. Corruption, check. Weak institutions, check. Adverse audit reports, check. Public protests against austerity, check. Argentina has been through 9 IMF programs since the 1950s. Not that I am particularly sad about them and their resistance. Pakistan is on the 23rd IMF program. 23 programs. And at what point do we stop calling it development assistance and call it what it really is? Debt management. Because here is the pattern. A country gets into a physical crisis. The IMF lends money with conditions. The conditions suppress growth and spark unrest. The country borrows more to stay afloat. The debt gets bigger. Eventually, there's another crisis. Then the IMF lends again. It's not a program. It's a subscription service. And you know what all these countries have in common? Beyond the debt, obviously. They're all geopolitically important enough that the international financial systems can't afford to let them collapse. Argentina is South America's 3rd largest economy. Ukraine is fighting a war with Russia. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And Kenya? Kenya is East Africa's financial hub. These countries are too important to fail, but not important enough to actually fix. So the IMF keeps lending, not to develop these economies, not to end poverty, not to even fight freaking corruption, to prevent financial contagion, to make sure a crisis in Argentina doesn't trigger a global bond market panic, to make sure Pakistan's collapse doesn't destabilize South Asia, to ensure that Kenya's default doesn't scare investors away from African markets. The IMF stabilizes the system, not the countries in it. And as long as these countries can fix or can still tax their citizens, can still squeeze out enough revenue to service the debt, the system stays stable. So when I tell you Kenya owes the IMF $4.09 billion, that's not just a number. That's Kenya's subscription fee to the international financial system. And like any subscription, your Apple Pay or your iCloud or your Google uh, YouTube Premium, you keep paying even when you're not getting what you paid for. All right. So we've established something here. Kenya isn't unique. This is happening everywhere. Now let's talk about where that IMF money actually goes when it hits Kenya's treasury. Let me give you the numbers. In 2023, Kenya's total public debt was about 10.5 trillion shillings. Of that, external debt was 5.1 trillion and domestic debt was 5.4 trillion. Now, in that same year, Kenya's debt service, just the interest and principal payments, not new borrowing, was about 1.3 trillion shillings. That's nearly 20% of the GDP going to debt service. For context, the entire health budget is about 2% of the GDP. We spend 10 times more servicing debt than we do on healthcare. And we wonder why healthcare in Kenya is, without the lack of a better word, is horrendous. So when Kenya borrows 200 billion shillings from the IMF, where does it go? Let's break it down. A chunk goes to budget support, plugging holes in the treasury so the government can keep functioning. Another chunk goes to paying off maturing bonds so Kenya doesn't default and get locked out of international markets. Another chunk goes to reserve accumulation, including foreign currencies so the shilling doesn't completely collapse. And how much goes to building new hospitals or schools or roads for that matter? Effectively zero, because that's not what IMF loans are for. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but isn't this just how debt works? You borrow, cover short-term gaps, then grow your way out of it. Sure. In theory, that is. But here's the problem. Kenya isn't growing, not fast enough at least. GDP growth in 2023 was about 5.6, which sounds good, right? But debt is growing faster. In 2020, Kenya's debt to GDP ratio was about 65%. By 2023, it was over 70%. So we are borrowing more, growing slower, and debt is eating a bigger and bigger share of the economy. This is what economists call a debt trap. You borrow to pay off old debt. That new debt accrues interest. You borrow more to pay that interest, and on and on and on and on. And the IMF's austerity conditions make it worse. Because when you cut spending and raise taxes during weak growth, you suppress growth even more, which means you need to borrow even more, which means more austerity. It's a perpetual motion machine, except instead of generating energy, it generates poverty. And here's the reality and here is a really insidious part. The IMF will tell you, well, if Kenya just fought corruption and improved governance, this wouldn't be a problem. And on one level, that's absolutely true. If Kenya stopped losing a third of its budget to corruption, we would have more physical space. But this is important. The IMF programs do not require, underline, bold, italicized, do not require that. They recommend it in the footnotes, in the governance section. But the binding conditions, the things that Kenya must do to get the money, those are all physical. Tax increases, spending cuts, subsidy removals. So in practice, what happens? Kenya raises taxes on ordinary people, cuts spending on hospitals and schools, and the corrupt systems, still there, still eating. The IMF gets paid, the bondholders get paid, and the and Kenyans get austerity. The IMF doesn't stabilize Kenya. It stabilizes the crisis. It makes sure the crisis doesn't spiral into a default that spooks international markets. But, and again, let me just say that again, but the crisis itself, the debt trap, the corruption, the collapsing services, that just continues. Because again, it's strictly business. Let's bring this home. We've talked about what the IMF monitors and what it ignores. We've talked about austerity and debt traps and robbing Peter to pay Paul. But now I want to talk about the human cost. Because there's a phrase I've been using throughout this episode. The citizen pays twice. And I want to explain exactly what that means. Payment number one, lost services. Let me give you some receipts. From the People's Audit, a citizen-led initiative that documents what Kenya's debt and corruption have actually cost ordinary people. Ghost schools. In Turkana County, 14 primary schools were funded under the World Bank Education Project. Total cost 680 million shillings. The schools were built but never equipped. No desks, no blackboards, no toilets. As of 2024, none of them were operational. 680 million shillings. But zero schools. Abandoned hospitals. Under the Managed Equipment Service Scheme, 23 county hospitals were constructed across Kenya, costing about 8.7 billion shillings. The buildings are there, but they were never equipped with the medical machinery they were designed for. So they sit empty, locked, gathering dust. 8.7 billion shillings, zero patients treated. And if you don't even believe me, you visit Kebaso Morara's Instagram page and look at the Vampire Diaries, and you will confirm what we are saying on the Kenyan week that was. Roads to nowhere. The Auditor-General's 2022-2023 reports identified 92 road projects, allocated 54 billion shillings that have stalled, some of which have been abandoned for over 5 years. Contractors were paid, roads were half built, and they continue to be impassable. 54 billion shillings, zero completed roads. Now, here's the thing. That money, that 680 million for ghost schools, that 8.7 billion for empty hospitals, that 54 billion for abandoned roads, that money was borrowed. It's part of Kenya's debt. So Kenyans didn't get the schools, didn't get the hospitals, and neither did they get the roads. But we still owe the money. And that brings us to payment number 2, debt service. Because now Kenya has to pay back those loans with interest. In 2024, Kenya spent approximately 1.5 trillion shillings on debt service. Let me put that in perspective. Education budget is about 544 billion shillings. Health budget, 111 billion shillings. Infrastructure, 202 billion. Debt service is almost double all three combined. And where does that 1.5 trillion come from? You guessed it. Taxes. Yours and mine. Every Kenyan's taxes. So here's the formula. Government borrows money. Money gets stolen or wasted. Citizens don't get services, and then government raises taxes to pay back the same loans. Citizens pay for the corruption. So effectively, we pay twice. Once when the money is stolen, and again when we repay the loan it was stolen from. And this is why the finance bill protests happened, and why Kenyans need to be continually vigilant on each and every finance bill. It wasn't just about taxes. It was about this, the fury of being told we need to raise VAT on bread because we have a physical deficit, while knowing the deficit exists because they stole the money and built ghost schools. The cruelty of being told we need to cut the healthcare budget while knowing we spend more on debt service for empty hospitals than we are on actual medicine. It's the indignity of it all. Or watching your government loot the treasury, or watching the IMF give them more money to loot, and then being told you need to tighten your belt. Let me read you something from the People's Audit Report. This is from a community focus group in Kisumu, talking about the devolved healthcare system. We were told devolution will bring healthcare closer to us. They built a level 4 hospital in our ward, big modern building. We were so proud, but when my son got malaria, I took him there. No doctor, no medicine. The nurses said the county hadn't paid salaries in 3 months, so most staff had unfortunately left. I had to take him to a private clinic, paid 3,500 shillings. I don't have that kind of money. The hospital is still there, empty, locked. They told us later the construction was funded by a loan. We're still paying it back through our taxes. So I paid for a hospital I can't use and then paid again to actually treat my son. That's what the citizens pay twice means. Not in theory, in practice. A mother in Kisumu paying for a locked hospital through her taxes. And then paying out of pocket for the healthcare she should have gotten for absolutely free. Multiply that story by millions. And the IMF sees none of this because the IMF doesn't track locked hospitals. It tracks debt service ratios. And as long as Kenya keeps taxing that mother in Kisumu, keeps squeezing 3,500 shillings here and 5,000 shillings there, enough to service the debt, the IMF indications will forever remain green. Program will always be on track. Physical consolidation will always be achieved. Debt sustainability maintained. And that mother, she's just a data point. So let's come back to the question we started with. Why doesn't the IMF care if Kenya is corrupt? And I think by now the answer is goddamn clear. Because corruption doesn't threaten IMF's money. Austerity protests do not threaten the IMF's money. Locked hospitals do not threaten the IMF's money. Ghost schools, again, they don't threaten the IMF's money. The only thing that threatens the IMF's money is default. And as long as Kenya can keep taxing its citizens, keep squeezing more revenue out of an exhausted population, default is not and isn't on the table. So IMF will keep lending and Kenya will continue to borrow and the money will continue to get stolen and the citizens, unfortunately, will continue to pay twice. And that cycle continues. And here's the thing that gets me. The IMF isn't evil. It's not even some cartoon villain twirling a mustache. It's just indifferent. It's an institution designed to do one thing: prevent financial crises from spiraling into a global contagion. And it does that job, sadly, pretty well. But in doing that job, it has created a system where governments can be corrupt without consequence. As long as they can steal tax, where citizens bear the cost of that corruption twice over, and where the lenders, the IMF, the bondholders, the banks will get paid no matter what. It's not conspiracy. It's just the logic of the system. And the system works for the IMF. So, what do we do? That's the question, right? I don't even have an easy answer. I'll tell you what we don't do. We don't pretend like this is about good governance or capacity building or any of that buzzword donors love to throw around. The IMF lends to corrupt governments because corruption doesn't threaten repayment. Full stop. Period. If we want that to change, we need to change the incentives. Make it so corruption does threaten repayment. Make it so austerity does threaten stability. Make it so the IMF can't ignore what's happening to ordinary Kenyans like you and myself. How, you ask? Citizen action, transparency, accountability, protests, audits, pressure. The finance bill protests prove that Kenya can force the government to back down. Now we need to force the IMF to pay attention, because here's the truth. Kenya isn't failing IMF tests. The IMF is passing its own. The IMF designed a system that protects lenders, and it's working. But it doesn't work for Kenyans, at least not anymore. And until we make that their problem, nothing will ever change. So, this has been the Kenyan Week that was. I'm DY. Stay angry, stay informed, and keep the freaking receipts. And like we always say, receipts over vibes always. And as we prepare to get into the Finance Bill 2025, keep vigilant, listen, watch, check, go into the internet, scout through, find the info. Do not be caught unawares at any given time. Again, Barakatele, and have yourselves a lovely day, night, or afternoon, wherever you are. See you next time.